In today's podcast, I want to talk about why traditional validation fails to heal the neurotypical spouse's hidden trauma. This is specifically relating to those of you who may be suffering from Cassandra syndrome. So if you're the neurotypical wife in a neurodiverse marriage and you've ever been told, well, you just need more validation, or he doesn't mean it that way, or try to understand his perspective, or he didn't sign up for autism, and all of this, right? But somehow, even with all of this validation, I put that in quotes, you still feel alone, unseen, and emotionally starved. This video here is going to try to explain why. And here's the truth that almost no one's talking about. Traditional validation doesn't just fail in neurodiverse relationships. It can actually make the pain worse. Not because you're too sensitive, not because your ASD husband doesn't care, but because the entire model of validation assumes something that simply isn't there. And that's this: a shared emotional language. A shared emotional language is not there. And when that language mismatch isn't addressed, validation turns into something else entirely. It turns into invisible isolation. Let's talk about the promise of validation and why it works everywhere else, in neurotypical relationships, right? So in most relationships, validation works beautifully. Why? Because both partners are operating from a similar emotional framework. One person says, I feel hurt when that happened. The other one responds, I can see why that hurt you. And something powerful happens in that moment. There's emotional mirroring, there's recognition, there's shared meaning, and that's what validation is supposed to be. It says, I see your inner world and I can step into it with you. But here's the problem. In a neurodiverse relationship, especially when alexithymia is present, that shared inner world doesn't function the same way. By the way, alexithymia is just a fancy word for emotions blindness. And if you're married to an autistic husband, he has many blind spots. Let's talk about the missing emotional bridge. I'm going to try to explain alexithymia very simply, okay? We're going to talk about what's really happening underneath, what you may view as insensitivity, uncaring, selfishness, narcissism, and so on. So people on the autism spectrum experience this alexithymia, and that's not a lack of care. It's not a lack of love. It's a difference in emotional processing. You can think of it like this. The neurotypical wife is speaking in a language of felt experience. In other words, I felt hurt. I felt disconnected. I felt alone. But the alexithymic partner is often operating in logic, data, observable facts, problem-solving frameworks, and so on. So when validation is expected, it's like asking someone to mirror a language they don't internally speak. And what happens next is where the real damage begins. So let's talk about that. When validation becomes mechanical, this is where many couples and even therapists get stuck. The autistic partner learns, okay, I'm supposed to say something like, I understand how you feel. So they say it. But the neurotypical wife feels nothing. Why? Because validation isn't just words. It's tone, timing, emotional resonance, facial expression, nervous system alignment, eye contact, a touch, and so on. You can feel the vibration of moral support. But when those elements are missing, the validation feels flat, scripted, disconnected, performative, feels like your ASD spouse is masking. And here's the painful part. The neurotypical partner often starts questioning their own reality. Why doesn't this feel comforting? I mean, he's trying. Why do I still feel alone even when he's saying the right things? And that confusion is the beginning of secondary trauma. So let's talk about that now. Secondary trauma in the neurodiverse relationship. And I want to name this thing very clearly. Secondary trauma is what happens when you reach for emotional connection and repeatedly encounter emotional absence. That's not intentional neglect, but it is unintentional emotional non-response. And over time, this creates a pattern. You express pain, you receive incomplete or mismatched validation. Your nervous system stays activated. The emotional wound never resolves. And eventually, you stop feeling just hurt. You start feeling invisible, invalidated, emotionally unsafe. And you feel like you just don't count, even though on the surface, nothing abusive is happening. This is why so many neurotypical spouses say, I feel alone in this marriage, but I can't explain why. Now let's talk about why traditional counseling often fails. And here's where this gets even more complicated. Traditional marriage counseling often teaches reflective listening, validation scripts, empathy statements, love languages, I feel statements, but those tools assume that both partners process emotions similarly. So what happens in the session? The therapist says to your autistic husband, "Can you validate her feelings?" And maybe he tries, but you still feel unseen. And now both spouses feel like they're failing. Your ASD husband thinks, "Well, I'm doing what I'm supposed to." And then you think, "Why isn't this working?" This creates relational hopelessness. Not because the relationship is doomed, but because the model being used doesn't fit the brain wiring. Now let's talk about the deeper truth. It's not about more validation, that's for sure. Here's the reframe that changes everything. The problem is not a lack of validation. The problem is a mismatch of emotional translation systems. You're not dealing with not enough empathy. You're dealing with different pathways to empathy. So instead of asking, well, how can I get more validation? The better question might be, how do we build a bridge between two emotional operating systems? And that's a completely different strategy. Now let's talk about what actually helps, okay? This is going to be a new model. And here's something that starts to work instead of the other stuff. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. First, translation before validation. So instead of expecting immediate empathy, you build shared meaning first. For example, instead of "I felt hurt," you might say, when that happened, my brain interpreted it as disconnection, and that creates emotional pain for me. Now you're giving structure to the feeling. 2, define emotional targets. Many autistic partners do better when they know, what outcome am I aiming for? Here's an example. You could say, "It helps me when you pause, look at me, and acknowledge that this matters to me." Number 3, separate intent from impact explicitly. Say this clearly. "I know you didn't intend to hurt me, but the impact still landed emotionally." This reduces defensiveness while preserving your reality. Number 4, build predictable emotional scripts that actually fit, okay? Not generic scripts, but custom-built language that aligns with how your ASD partner processes stuff. If you've been feeling like validation isn't working, you're not imagining that it has not been working, and you're not asking too much. You've just been given a model that wasn't designed for your neurodiverse relationship. And once you understand that, everything begins to shift. Not overnight, but directionally. And that direction matters, because the goal isn't perfect emotional mirroring. The goal is feeling understood in a way that actually reaches you. Now, if this podcast resonated with you, I'd love to hear what part of this felt most true to your experience. And if you want to go deeper into this, I'll be creating more on how to actually build that bridge step by step. Please like, subscribe, and comment. I read and respond to all comments. I'll see you in the next video. Would you like to schedule a paid private coaching session? This will be in the form of a face-to-face Zoom call. Underneath any of my videos, you'll see this Calendly link. If you click on that link, it'll open up my calendar. You can pick the available days and times that works for your schedule. You'll get a follow-up email immediately after purchasing a session that will have the Zoom link that coincides with the day and time that you picked. I will get an email too that you scheduled a session, and I will be available on that exact day and time, and we will talk. I look forward to working with you.